So you guys have been asking me to cover the story where Spider-Man becomes Man-Spider. Now, it is important to specify that Spider-Man does technically get 4 extra arms, so he becomes 6-armed Spider-Man in Amazing Spider-Man issue number 100, but that's not really Man-Spider in the way that you think of him. This is the version of Man-Spider that you think of when you think of that character. So this takes place in Marvel Fanfare issues 1 through 2. It's technically part of a larger storyline in Marvel Fanfare issues 1 through 4, but at the end of issue number 2, Peter takes off. What this does is it picks up with a woman by the name of Tanya Anderson. Now, Tanya Anderson debuted back in X-Men issue number 60, and she was basically a character who was introduced along with another guy by the name of Karl Lykos. Those of you guys who are very familiar with Marvel Comics know who he is. If you don't, Karl Lykos is a character also known as Sauron. The long and short of it is that Tanya and Karl were basically part of an expedition. And what ends up happening is that Tanya basically gets lost. That was in X-Men issue number 60. Karl finds her, but then he's bit by a pterodactyl, and that transforms him, so he has to consume energy in order to keep himself alive. We'll talk about that more as we get further into this. What's happening in the here and now is that Tanya is recruiting both Peter Parker and Angel. She initially starts off with Warren Worthington, and the idea is that she's trying to get down to the Savage Land and she needs some kind of a guide, someone to basically offer some measure of protection against the threats that exist down there, because initially she thought Karl was dead, but then she ends up realizing he's alive, and so that's her whole mission here. Now, initially Warren shoots it down, right? Warren doesn't really want to have anything to do with this, and in fact, Tanya does give us a little bit of an origin here, for those of you guys who were interested in this portion of it, right? She says, Karl was a childhood friend and later the man that I loved. I first met him in Tierra del Fuego, where he saved my life. In gratitude, my father raised Karl. After Karl's own father died suddenly, he put himself through medical school, became a brilliant though unorthodox physician, but nothing he did made him worthy in my father's eyes. And none of us knew Karl was living under a terrible curse. I've read his notes. To live, he had to drain energies from other living beings. Finally, an overdose of such energy transformed him into a monster that he christened Sauron. He tried to kill my father, fought the X-Men, then fled to his home in Tierra del Fuego after the recent human side of his personality won out over his evil Sauron self. There, instead of living with his incurable curse, he decided it would be better not to live. After that, I never went home, never spoke to my father again. I joined the Peace Corps and spent 2 wonderful, back-breaking years working in the Andean highlands. Yet no matter what I did or how hard I tried, I could not forget that Karl had become an energy vampire because of me. He'd been infected by the pteranodons that still exist in Tierra del Fuego, whose nest I'd unwittingly disturbed. In saving me, he'd condemned himself. If I had defied my father and stayed with Karl, I might have been able to help him. Now, here's the important thing to know here, and this is kind of a little bit of a side thing. In this particular moment, specifically with Marvel Fanfare and this idea of Sauron, this is Chris Claremont taking all of that and rolling it into his era. All this stuff, right, X-Men issues 60 to 61, that was all Roy Thomas stuff, and that was effectively one of the last storylines we got in the X-Men line before it was basically canceled and turned into reprints until Giant Size X-Men number 1 came out. So this was kind of Chris Claremont adopting all this mythos during his time writing the X-Men and Marvel. Now again, Warren shoots this offer down, and in fact he goes so far as to say, look, my help's not for sale, and has it ever occurred to you that assuming he is alive, that Karl has not left the Savage Land because he hasn't wanted to leave, that maybe he's made peace with himself and his curse down there. He might even be happy, so why not let the guy be? And that's where basically Tanya turns on the waterworks, and at that point, it tugs at the one thing that always convinces Warren Worthington to help people out, which is the fact that it's a damsel in distress type of feeling. And so at that point, we switch over to the Daily Bugle. And what ends up happening here is Peter Parker is being approached by Robbie Robertson and J. Jonah Jameson to go back to the Savage Land. Now, the reason why I say to go back is because in Amazing Spider-Man issues 103 and 104, Peter had already been there. And in fact, that involved a guy by the name of Richard Culkin, that Richard had come across a being called Gog, and that the Daily Bugle, in learning about all of this, wanted Peter Parker to go investigate, potentially the idea that it could make for just great news headlines, and J. Jonah Jameson could basically sell a whole bunch of copies of the paper. When Peter Parker went down there and Peter Parker encountered Gog, he almost died, and that's why Peter does not want to go back. And so at the end of the day, J. Jonah Jameson asked the question, what's it going to take for you to get there, right? And Peter Parker just says, it'll take more money. because you notoriously underpay me. And so ultimately Jameson says yes, and Peter Parker goes on the expedition alongside Warren and Tanya to the Savage Land. Now, that takes us into the nature of the Savage Land, specifically what it is that's going on. Now, we do get an explanation from Chris Claremont because he's the one that's writing this story, so we'll kind of fill those gaps as time goes on, but he doesn't really do much to explain the Savage Land in Marvel Comics. And I think that while Peter Parker does become Man-Spider in this place, the Savage Land is a spot that I think a lot of people are familiar with, but almost nobody knows about. So the original explanation, and the one that's really kind of preferred when it comes to the nature of the Savage Land, is that it's effectively a game preserve, that at some point in Earth's history, the Beyonders had reached out to a group called the Nuwali. This is long before Al Ewing retconned the nature of the Beyonders. This is back when they were just beings that existed outside the multiverse and were curious about the main Marvel Universe. What ends up happening is that all these creatures from across the world are put down in the Savage Land when that area of Antarctica is turned into a lush jungle. And so that's why you see all kinds of critters down here, dinosaurs and the whole 9 yards. Now, it also does have a whole other history involving Magneto, which we'll also talk about because that becomes a part of this. But the Savage Land is exactly what it sounds like. It's a very, very dangerous place. And so what ends up going on is that Chris Claremont kind of gives us this statement where he says, the terrain below is desolate, as forbidding and inhospitable as any on Earth, and yet it possesses a fierce elemental beauty that cannot help but stir the soul. And so as these guys are descending down into the Savage Land, they're attacked by a dinosaur, right? And what happens is exactly what you would think happens. The helicopters hit, the thing comes crashing down, Peter Parker and Tanya parachute. Because Warren's got wings, he doesn't really have to worry about that too much. It almost looks like they're stranded. But one of the things Peter Parker says is that this crew had actually landed up the cliff near the top, right? They looked okay, they waved their radio as I floated by, so they're probably calling for help right now, which was effectively Chris Claremont telling us now they have an out. They're not stranded down here. Not only that, Warren chimes in and says the Navy has an emergency station on the far side of the mountains. I think I should fly us out to it. And at that point, Tanya says, no, right? We can't leave. Like, we just got here. And so Warren's kind of the voice of reason, right? He says, like, we've got no supplies. If we stay, we are asking for trouble. We are not equipped to stay here long term. And so Peter's just kind of like, I mean, we've come this far, Warren. Like, we've come this far, man. Like, the least we can do is have a look around. Now, of course, Peter's also got money on the line. But more so than that, there was kind of a thing that went on here, right? One of the things that J. Jonah Jameson told Peter, if you do not come back with some kind of an award-winning story, don't come back at all. So it's not just a matter of the fact that Peter's got money on the line. His job is on the line. His livelihood is on the line. Now, one of the things to know, and the reason why this matters, is that if this story came out right now, you would kind of dismiss it as, oh, you know, it's just Jameson being Jameson. No. Back during this era in Marvel Comics, when J. Jonah Jameson told Peter, come back with a story or don't come back at all, he meant it, right? This was a time when you could lose your job, right? When the statements made by guys like J. Jonah Jameson were very, very real because the characters felt very, very real. In a lot of ways now in Marvel Comics, I mean, truth to tell, I wouldn't go so far as to say the characters feel cartoonish, but in a lot of ways, it never really feels like there's actual stakes to anybody making a mistake or not doing what they were instructed to do, if that makes any sense. And so when Peter goes to grab Tanya, she kind of thanks him initially for backing her up, but he tells her, I wasn't really, but it'll be dark soon, and in this neighborhood, it gets really dark really fast because there are no lights here. When the sun sets, there's no street lamps, there's no torches, no nothing, so we won't be able to see anything. And he says, I think we'll be better off finding shelter for the night before leaving first thing in the morning. But he says, in the meantime, I guess there's not much harm in some sightseeing. As I recall, these highlands are pretty barren. Most of the people who live here, or whatever dangerous threats exist out here, they live down in the jungle itself. But in the midst of that, Warren Worthington tells them, I found something, right? And here's what's really interesting. And Chris Claremont fills us in. He says, almost completely filling the valley below, its great shattered dome, towering above one of the natural geothermal pits that help warm the Savage Land and preserve its prehistoric environment. Here stands a ruined, futuristic city. It's a monument to the dreams of an ancient reincarnated mad god named Garokk, dreams that almost destroyed the Savage Land and in the end consumed the god himself. Now, that takes place in X-Men issues 113 and 116. Some people call it the Savage Land Saga. To a degree, that's true. It kind of goes by different names depending on who you're talking to. But Garokk and Zaldane are two characters that you are very familiar with if you ever watched X-Men the animated series. The long and short of it is that following the original events involving Magneto and so on, which again we'll also talk about here in a minute, Garokk had basically tried to seize control of this place, and for a time he almost did. It was almost kind of like a civil war within the Savage Land itself. That's the nature of this place. There's always some group vying for power, trying to control everybody else and overthrow whoever it is that's leading at that point in time. Ultimately, Garokk was killed. But one of the funny statements that's made here by Warren is in looking at all of this. He says, one thing about the X-Men, you can usually tell where they've been. Right, and Peter just says, we could wander through that place for years and still only ever see a fraction of it, right? It's that huge. And that's where he kind of talks to himself about the idea that he should certainly get some pictures. But what ends up going on is in the middle of all this, they're attacked by the denizens of the Savage Land, right? Basically barbarians, for lack of a better word. Now, these were effectively servants of Garokk, kind of the last holdouts that follow his lead, but they're actually being led by somebody else at this point. Now, where Warren steps in and tries to fight these guys, suddenly his senses go haywire. Peter Parker, on the other hand, still maintains a secret identity at this point within Marvel Comics, but he's kind of having this internal debate on whether or not he should just cast his identity aside and start facing off against these guys, keeping in mind that now it will become public knowledge, not necessarily for the Savage Land Mutates, but specifically for someone like Tanya, who's standing right there next to him. And so one of the things that Tanya tells him is like, we're backing up against the cliff at the edge of a river. And Peter's just like, perfect, and like pushes her over the cliff. Right? She splashes into the water and just goes whisking away. But at that point, while it doesn't necessarily kill her, it does give Peter the chance to put on his costume and jump into the fight. But almost as soon as he takes these guys out, his senses start to go haywire, only for him to be subdued by Barbarous. And for those of you guys who are familiar with Barbarous in Marvel Comics, you probably know, just like I know, that this guy had to have been an inspiration for the character of Goro in Mortal Kombat. There's no way he wasn't. But Peter is basically overtaken, right? And so what ends up happening is he wakes up in a lab. And this is where the man-spider element comes into play, because what ends up happening is that in seeing all of this, right, he says, I'm manacled to a table. My captors are not taking any chances. Angel is still out cold, and I do not like the looks of that machine, especially since it's pointed at me. And I think I can break free, but I've got to stall for time, get my strength back. But then he starts looking around like, where in the heck is he? And that's where he's met by a guy that he has never seen before. Now, this guy's name is Brainchild, and he's actually a Savage Land mutate. So, wind the clock back in Marvel Comics. During the first real meaningful appearance of the Savage Land in Marvel, specifically in relation to the X-Men, Magneto had shown up here and turned it into a base of operations. When he did, he used this device to basically mutate individuals within the Savage Land, providing them with abilities. They became the Savage Land mutates, and what ends up happening is when the X-Men arrive on the scene in exploring the Savage Land, they face off against Magneto, and they're joined by Ka-Zar, who we'll talk about here in a second because he does become a part of the story. Now, following Magneto's defeat, that's when Garokk comes into play. Garokk had brought these guys under his control and tried to seize control of the Savage Land. Of course, ultimately Garokk was killed, and now these guys are kind of operating of their own accord, but they've taken the machinery of Magneto and started using it for their own purposes. And that's what Brainchild says, right? You are awake, right? Incredible. Barbarous beating would have crushed a dozen ordinary men. Welcome, human, to the Citadel of our creator, Magneto. I am called Brainchild, and I am master here. Blind Gaza and the four-armed Barbarous you have already met. My emerald-skinned comrade is Amphibious, and the young lady Vertigo. We are mutants. Now, Vertigo's cool. She gets that name because she causes vertigo in people, right? She starts making your world go topsy-turvy. But Brainchild says, soon, with your help and the angels, we will be the rulers of the Savage Land. This arcane device was used by Magneto to evolve us from simple swamp savages into our present superpowered incarnations. When Angel and his fellow X-Men defeated Magneto, this genetic transformer was destroyed. We have since repaired it and added some interesting modifications. Now, in addition to performing its original function, it can also devolve any living being to its primordial beginnings. We had originally planned to test our device on Ka-Zar, but now that you and Angel are here, the honor will be yours. Now, this was an important distinction here, because this was basically Marvel and Chris Claremont kind of toying with the idea that Spider-Man, if he was ever devolved on an evolutionary level, would basically turn into a gigantic spider, hence the nature of man-spider. Now, the reason why I say that this is so important is because this becomes the foundation for storylines like The Other, right? This is where they draw that kind of concept from. Up until this point in time, as far as I'm aware, the general idea of Peter Parker was that he was just bitten by a radioactive spider and gained the proportional powers of a spider, which pretty much all you guys are aware of. But over the years, up until this point, Marvel had started toying with the difference between mutants and mutates. And as a quick explanation here, mutants are exactly what they sound like. People with X genes that are activated at some point in time and they develop powers. Mutates are individuals whose entire genetic structure has been modified in such a way that you cannot go back to their original form. Peter Parker is one of those. And so that's kind of the cool thing that Claremont was toying with. Because his DNA is forever changed, any kind of de-evolution that would happen to him would take him back to a form that is a primitive reflection of what his DNA currently is within Marvel Comics. It's a genius strategy, to be honest, when it comes to storytelling. And so in this moment and in hearing this, Peter Parker says, that I think is my cue, because I am not going to be de-evolved. So he says, sorry, big brain, but flawed though I may be, I like myself the way that I am. And in that moment, Vertigo attacks him at the direction of Brainchild. And so Claremont tells us, the harder Spider-Man fights the disorienting effects of Vertigo's power, the faster his world seems to spin around in circles. But still, he struggles with all his strength of sinew and will in a desperate attempt to break free. An attempt that is doomed to failure from the moment Brainchild activates the Transformer. As the moments slide by, he finds it more difficult to think. Sentences drift out of reach, then words, leaving him only primal physical feelings and responses like rage, pain, fear, hatred, and lust. As simply, as easily as an onion stripped of its skin, so is Spider-Man stripped of his humanity. He feels himself drowning in a black, oily whirlpool within his own mind. A terrible, terrifying scream follows him down into the darkness as he's pulled inexorably under. At the last instant, with his last rational thought, he realizes that the scream is his. Now, FYI, Chris Claremont wrote this way all the time. It's why I loved Chris Claremont's work on the X-Men. You can see why his X-Men run was so incredibly popular. The guy was gifted in how he would phrase things. But this transitions us over to Ka-Zar. Now, Ka-Zar's story does pick up with Tanya and then circles back into Man-Spider. And it's actually kind of cool. So Ka-Zar is one of these guys that is criminally underappreciated in Marvel Comics, very much like Conan the Barbarian. Technically, Marvel didn't own the rights to Conan, which is why you don't necessarily see Conan anymore. But stories like Savage Avengers were basically focused on an Avengers team where Conan led it. But the bigger point that I'm making here is that Marvel has these characters that, whether they own the character or the rights are lent out to them, are oftentimes underappreciated characters. Ka-Zar is one of them. He's essentially Marvel's version of Tarzan in a lot of ways, but he's kind of like a freedom fighter within the Savage Land, right? He protects the place against whatever threats exist out there. What's also cool is that Karl Lykos is alive, and Karl Lykos is down here with Ka-Zar. And in fact, Tanya had been rescued by both Karl and Ka-Zar. And so that's where you have Chris Claremont kind of filling in the gaps between what happened with Magneto and the X-Men and what happened here now. Because once Tanya wakes up, that basically Ka-Zar fills her in on everything. He says, our goal is the ruined Citadel where you and your friends were attacked. Its construction was ordered by the mad god Garokk and his high priestess Zaldane. Together, they meant to conquer the Savage Land. With the aid of the mutant X-Men, we ended Garokk's reign of terror. He himself was slain. His priestess was taken prisoner, his legions dispersed, their power forever broken, or so we thought. Lately, we've heard rumors of a resurgence of this cult, led by the cadre of superpowered mutants created years ago by the X-Men's foe Magneto. And so what's effectively happened here is that Peter and Angel and Tanya have just kind of unwittingly stumbled into a war within the Savage Land. This has seemingly been going on for quite some time. Though while this is kind of like the first opening salvo, the fact is, it's been building up to this point. And so the problem is that in the midst of this discussion, suddenly, Angel and Peter show up in their mutated forms. And Tanya doesn't initially know what's going on. No one really does, right? She's just like, wow, like Carl was hit by a gigantic bird, right? Something struck him. And she's like, I can see it in the firelight. And she says, those scraps of costume, right? It can't be, but it is. And you end up seeing Warren Worthington basically de-evolve down into just this nightmarish bird form. But while that happens, Claremont tells us his cry is as inhuman as his appearance, as he dives once more toward the camp, scattering Tonga's warriors with his wings, slashing at them with beak and razor-sharp claws. He is a demon, incarnate, possessed by a berserker rage that can only be sated with blood. At the same moment, nearby, other claws hurl Ka-Zar to the ground, and that's when he realizes he's being pinned by Peter, right? Peter is just like this nightmarish, mutated spider form. Now, Ka-Zar's incredibly strong and incredibly durable, but against this version of Peter, it's kind of nuts. But here's the funny thing about this, is that Chris Claremont tells us what's going on with Peter Parker, and it's not as clear-cut as Peter Parker having lost himself entirely. That he actually says, the facade has changed beyond all recognition, yet within the monster's shell, a human soul battles for supremacy, and for a moment, triumphs, because he pulls himself off of Ka-Zar. And Claremont says, in those seconds, Peter Parker realizes what he has become, what he was about to do, and he screams in agony to the uncaring heavens, howling. So while the angel obeys an urge as old as life itself and soars skyward with a captive, Spider-Man merely leaves. And so once the threat's over with and Tanya's essentially whisked away, all you have left is Tonga and Ka-Zar and Carl, who are trying to figure out what to do. Now, of course, Tonga says, right, 11 dead, 19 wounded, and most of those will die by the morning. And so the issue that they're dealing with here is that they just don't have enough numbers. They don't have enough people to be able to launch a full frontal attack against Brainchild and everybody else within the Citadel. And so what they have to do is start marshaling forces. But in that moment, Ka-Zar picks up a piece of Spider-Man's costume, and in looking at this, realizes that it's part of Spider-Man's costume, and asks the question, right, was the monstrosity that I fought him, right? But what power could have changed him so? What fiend could have done that to him and turned him into this thing? And so at that point, you switch back over to Brainchild, who now has Tanya. And he just kind of repeats what he initially said to Spider-Man and to Angel, basically telling her that he plans to de-evolve her. But in the midst of all of this, literally within the next panel, so it happens incredibly fast, Ka-Zar and all of his forces end up launching an attack against Brainchild in the Citadel. And that's when all hell breaks loose, because Carl realizes the woman he loves is in danger and will be de-evolved the same way that Peter and Angel were. So it's literally a fight for love. And so that's when Ka-Zar says, right, do not stand there, man, charge. Do not give them a chance to react. And that's why Carl just says, there's an easier way. Either Brainchild returns Tanya to normal now, or I will blow his brains out, because in this moment, she's being de-evolved. Now, what's crazy is that Vertigo ends up using her powers on Carl, but in that moment, he flinches, pulls the trigger, and ends up hitting Vertigo. And so while this massive battle is going on, Spider-Man is watching it all, right? And Claremont tells us, on the sidelines, the man-spider watches and waits. A nigh irresistible lust for battle, for blood, eats away at his soul like a cancer, yet he does not move. His conditioning forces him to serve Brainchild, while his fragmented memories, plus what remains of his self-awareness, urge him to help Ka-Zar. And so torn, he does neither. But ultimately, one side wins out over the other. And it's the Peter side, because when that happens, he attacks Barbarous and then flings him across the room into the machinery, which basically destroys it. And that's the crazy thing here, because now that that machinery is destroyed, Brainchild says, right, the Transformer has basically been destroyed here. Imbecile, you may have defeated me, but in the process, you've damned yourself. Without the Transformer, you can never be restored to normal. You will live out your pathetic life as you are. Only I can reconstruct this device, and no power on Earth can make me do it. And so in this moment, you have two things happening at the same time. The first one is for Peter himself, right? He says, it's so hard to think. It takes so much effort. I can feel primal urges, lust, getting harder to control. I cannot hold on much longer. And so he addresses Ka-Zar and he says, if there's no hope, I beg you, kill me. Please, it's better to die than to go on as this obscenity. And Ka-Zar says, no, my friend, you must not despair. There's always hope. We will find a way. While that's going on, Carl, in looking at all of this, says, I've never felt so sick. Everything's quiet. The war must be over. And since I'm still alive, I guess the good guys won. But what about Tanya, right? She's been de-evolved into a Neanderthal, and with the Transformer wrecked, she can never be cured. But then he starts to think about it, and he says, this Transformer creates mutants. I absorb energy to live. Theoretically, if I drain that energy from Tanya, I might be able to return her to normal. But there is a terrible risk. Small doses of energy cannot harm me, but a large one might well change me into my evil self. And so he just says, Lord, give me strength. I can see no other solution. If this gamble pays off, I can cure them all. Angel, Tanya, Peter Parker. But I must be careful. The more power I take, the more I crave. My human self must remain in control. And so in this moment, when you switch back over to Ka-Zar, in looking at Peter and realizing that the man-spider persona has completely taken over, he realizes he has no choice but to kill Peter. Because if he doesn't do it, the tribes that exist in the Savage Land will do it on their own at some point in time. Because if the man-spider stays alive, he'll just start wreaking havoc, right? Running amok throughout this entire place. But before he can do anything, Carl grabs Peter and then drains the energy off of him, which comes after he's done this with Tanya, and then he in turn grabs Warren and drains the energy off of him, reverting him back to normal. The problem is that it leads to the rebirth of Sauron, and this was Chris Claremont bringing the character back. For those of you guys who were familiar with the character but never really knew how it was that he came back after he quote-unquote died in the old school comics from Roy Thomas, this is when it happens. And where Ka-Zar goes to make a move to destroy Sauron, the problem is that he flies away before anything can happen. And that's where he says, mark me, Ka-Zar, there is war between us. It will be as fierce and bloody as this land that you love, the land I was born to rule, and it can have but one ending. First, I will take your soul, and then your wretched life. And after a few days, right, we're told at an American research rescue station just outside the Savage Land, there's a helicopter waiting for everybody. And so what this does is it leads to Peter Parker and Warren basically getting on the helicopter and flying away, while at the same time, Tanya stays behind alongside Ka-Zar, and that goes into issues 3 and 4, which is when the X-Men show up on the scene and they become a part of this conflict, which does not involve Spider-Man. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. This is how Spider-Man became the Man-Spider. Tomorrow we'll cover the other. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.